vast wealth of Europe was acquired by the labor of slaves on plantations in the West Indies. Okay? And that is something that people don't often reckon with. Britain and France were vying for who had superiority to dominate the world economic stage. Britain and France went to war. And part of that war was Britain annexing Martinique and Guadeloupe. And once that happened, the revenues of Britain shot straight up because those were two sugar producing plantations. And France ended up losing out, although it came into the war the economic dominant one. It came out of the war the one who lost. Britain became the world superpower by 15, 20 years later because it had annexed major sugar plantation holdings from the Caribbean. And so we have to understand the wealth of modern Europe, of Britain and modern Europe, also being fueled by the plantation system in the West Indies, the enforced enslavement, the rape and the murder, from the very dark and the history of this archipelago that we call Caribbean. We have to understand that too, that there's this symbiotic relationship between what we experience in the region in terms of slavery and all that it brought, and the wealth that Britain emerged with because of its holdings of West Indian sugar plantations. And that has to be understood before we get now to the emancipation. And just want to add in here that Dr. Eric Williams, one of his central thesis on capitalism and slavery was that it was the slave was an active participant in bringing the end of slavery. As much as Wilberforce and company were active in Europe in lobbying against slavery, the slave made the plantation system a system that was not sustainable. It became more and more costly, and more difficult to sustain, and therefore it as an economic model became outmoded. And so you can't see the slave just as a passive participant in the process of emancipation. And that for our ancestors in the region, they participated in this emancipation movement, and by making the plantation a very difficult economic model to sustain. And that was the rioting, the burning, all the different ways in which they made the thing unsustainable. But that dynamic between Europe and the Caribbean, and the declaration then in 1807 that British slavery came to an end, that declaration of the end of the slave trade, not slavery yet, but of the slave trade in 1807, that set in motion immigration into Trinidad. So the Chinese arrived. They arrived in 1806. Once they understood that the slave trade was ending, they sent now for other peoples whom Britain had annexed their territory. So the first group coming was a group of Chinese in 1806. And they came in preparation for the scarcity of labor